Hi everyone! I'm here on my yoga mat today to channel my inner yogi because I'm gonna try really hard to be nice in this video. Which will be a challenge, but I'm always down for a yoga challenge. And to emulate AOC, there will be no swearing in this video. We're gonna keep it super profesh.
I'll go through the videos and respond until they get 3 strikes, and a strike is for misrepresenting me, making no effort to fact-check empirical claims, or making fallacious arguments. Obviously, there's a little subjectivity involved there, but I'll do my best to explain the reasoning behind each strike.
I decided to implement my own strike system. Same rules, but I want to be charitable and respond to the entirety of her video. So I will allow infinite strikes. I will say, I find her strike system a bit hubristic. I understand not responding to every single point for the sake of time, but the strikes seem to serve as a cop-out. She only made it to the 7-minute 30 mark of my 25-minute long video.
Okay, so video number 1 is Unnatural Vegan Lives in Opposite Land by Klein. I have to say, I really like that title. It's funny. So she includes the clip of me describing neoliberalism as like being a typical left-leaning social progressive, but also being generally pro-free market with few restrictions on most industries, particularly housing, but also being like pro-welfare state, as libertarians would call it. Pro like a strong safety net.
As countless people have pointed out in the comments, her definition of neoliberal does not match the commonly understood definition. It's important to note that language evolves over time. The origin of the term seems to align with her view, modern economic policy with state intervention. This ideology stood in opposition to laissez-faire classical liberalism. But how it is defined today differs from how it was defined in the past. Attempting to restore its original meaning, as Swayze is doing, is futile.
So credit where credit is due, she actually looked it up and saw that, how I use it is consistent with the root of the term. A lot of people did not make it that far, so thank you. How I and others use neoliberal is contrary to how many use it, because many use it as a pejorative, right? As like you're a neoliberal, gross, right? Like if you polled opposite ends of the political spectrum, you'd find conservatives consider neoliberal like socialism, whereas lefties define it as some sort of like anti-welfare anarcho-capitalism. I mean, if you'd asked Americans even just a couple decades ago what atheist meant, you would get a lot of pretty confident responses that it means that we worship the devil. Does that make it a credible definition of atheism because a lot of people believe that? No. Similarly, we've all had the experience of, I'm going to say the grandma, but lots of different people have done this, insisting that, hey, you can order the spaghetti and meatballs, just scrape off the meatballs, that's still vegan. Were they right? Did they understand veganism and the definition of veganism better than actual vegans? Basically, who has more business defining a word? The people who actually self-identify as that word, or the people who hate them, who hate those people who identify as that word? Because the people today who actually identify as neoliberal overwhelmingly agree with me. I'm not trying to restore the original meaning or usage of neoliberal. I'm simply using the word in the way that people who describe themselves as neoliberal use the word.
Wikipedia, which Swayze cites often, defines neoliberalism as policies of economic liberalization, including privatization, deregulation, globalization, free trade, austerity, and reductions in government spending in order to increase the role of the private sector. However, I won't deny that the defining features of neoliberalism are subject to debate. Since I don't want to get bogged down in semantics, I would be happy to just run with her definition. The problem is, she's not operating off consistent, coherent definitions. She defines neoliberal as your typical left-leaning social progressive, but generally pro-free market with a few restrictions on a lot of industries like housing, but also very pro-welfare state. She claims to be in favor of a strong social safety net, yet she supports policies that impede a strong social safety net, such as austerity. You could say that she is semi-pro-welfare state, but to be very pro-welfare state and pro-austerity makes no sense. These directly conflict. It's funny that she claims labels should be defined by the people who identify with them rather than the people who oppose them. Yet she insists that her definition of socialism is the right one, despite being anti-capitalist. Strike one for fallacious reasoning. Although it is commonly associated with the economic policies introduced by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, most people would describe Reagan and Thatcher as standard conservatives. Neoliberal more accurately describes corporate Democrats like Clinton and Obama.
Yeah, and I did agree with a lot of Hillary Clinton's policies. I think a lot of lefties underestimate just how progressive she was on social policies. You know, they were pretty busy demonizing her. This is a good example.
They represent this concept of rainbow capitalism, where they throw us a bone on social issues, but they still serve the ruling class.
I will say that neoliberals kind of moving further left is more recent. You've got the subprime mortgage crisis, which kind of convinced everyone that the financial sector needs regulation. You've got recent studies on how a public option or even free medical care would be economically beneficial. Studies alluding to basic income being possibly a really efficient means of stimulus that promotes development of small businesses.
To clarify, I wasn't saying that Thatcher and Reagan weren't neoliberal. That's a verifiable fact. It's still accurate to describe them as such. I was saying that how the term is used colloquially, it better describes Clinton and Obama, because when most people hear the term liberal, they think Democrat rather than Republican. But both Democrats and Republicans can embrace neoliberal policies. And sure, Clinton is progressive compared to Trump, but that doesn't make her a progressive. She was fervently opposed to Medicare for all. The left rightfully demonized her for taking money from Wall Street and being a war hawk. It was Bernie Sanders who was unfairly maligned. UV had nothing to say to my point about rainbow capitalism. It was dismissed without an actual argument as to why it was unfair criticism. Strike two for fallacious reasoning.
I suspect it'd be harder to get a lot of Americans, at least, on board with like market socialism, given that socialism is still a pretty dirty word. Maybe that will change, and if it does, that's fine. Like I said, I don't really have any political ideology. Neoliberal is just kind of the closest thing that I fit into, I guess. But if someone wants to call it something else, that's fine.
It's hard to get Americans on board with socialism because of people like you, Swayze. Defining capitalism as simply markets and socialism as draconian government control, of course people will favor capitalism over socialism. But this is a distortion. Although being apolitical is technically a political stance, if someone who genuinely stays out of politics claims they don't have a political ideology, I wouldn't push back too hard. But Unnatural Vegan made a video titled Anti-Capitalism is Anti-Vegan, where she takes a firm anti-capitalist stance. That is a political ideology. I've said in the past that I haven't read enough political theory to attach myself to a particular label. Currently, I don't identify as a communist or an anarchist. If I had to choose a label, I would probably pick eco-socialist. But the fact that I don't fit into a specific box doesn't mean I don't have a political ideology.
I will say it's important to remember that Twitter and like comment sections are not real life. Just because a large number of people in the comments are saying neoliberal means one thing certainly doesn't mean they're right, and doesn't even mean that most people agree with them. Like, how many people who aren't online, like extremely online, even know the word neoliberal? Or maybe they know it but like use it regularly? I don't know. I would doubt many. I learned it from Twitter. I had never heard that word before Twitter.
The lack of self-awareness here is strong. It would be like a Republican insisting on reclaiming the label Democrat because the parties switched platforms and the Democratic Party used to be the Conservative Party.
No, but it's interesting because I think that's what Catherine's doing by misrepresenting neoliberal policies. She at least admits that neoliberal isn't defined by Reagan and Thatcher, but she fails to consider its evolution through the Clinton era and into today's post-recession era.
How have I failed to consider its evolution? I said that how the term is used today, it more accurately describes Clinton and Obama. Strike three for misrepresenting my argument. Today, neoliberalism is characterized by the embrace of free market capitalism, deregulation, free trade, privatization, and austerity, aka cuts to social spending.
Austerity does not mean cuts to social spending. I see that she clicked on the link because it's purple, but apparently she didn't actually read it beyond just cherry picking what she wanted. So yeah, that's strike number one. Austerity is a set of political economic policies that aim to reduce government budget deficits through spending cuts, tax increases, or a combination of both. Austerity measures are often used by governments that find it difficult to borrow or meet their existing obligations to pay back loans. It's basically another word for fiscal responsibility.
In the real world, spending cuts translates to cuts to social spending. She's the one cherry picking. Strike 4 for making no attempt to fact-check empirical claims. Her framing of this issue is completely backwards, which I'll get into.
A country cannot exist in perpetually increasing national debt. At some point, you are going to become insolvent and incapable of making payments or borrowing more money. As much as I would love an infinite supply of free money with no obligations, no strings attached, to help people, to help the poor, it's not realistic. This is why far left proposals have bipartisan opposition. Anybody who knows how money works knows that these proposals don't work.
First of all, deficit spending is crucial to building a healthy economy. The New Deal pulled us out of the Great Depression. Other countries saw how successful the Keynesian economic model was in the US and followed suit. Newly independent countries in the global south began to build up their economies, and the welfare of their citizens began to rise. But powerful countries like the US didn't like this because it threatened their own interests. They wanted to keep these countries subservient so they could exploit them for cheap labor and expand their markets. Rich countries levied their power and began meddling in elections and initiating coups so they could install dictators who would serve their interests. Institutions like the IMF and the World Bank began offering enticing loans to poor countries, under the condition that they agree to their terms of trade and debt repayment. Government leaders accepted these terms without the support of their citizens, and this became known as neo-colonialism, or more specifically, structural adjustment. The terms included free trade, which undercut farmers and local businesses, and austerity, which massively cut social spending on things like education and healthcare. Tax revenue went almost entirely towards debt repayment, with ever-increasing interest rates. Their economies began to collapse as unemployment rose and welfare declined. It was predatory lending and austerity, not deficit spending, that led them into perpetual debt. Strike 5 for failing to fact-check. It's not fiscal responsibility, it's manipulation. Second, I would love to know what far-left policies she's referring to here. Because many far-left proposals, such as Medicare for all, free college, and a $15 minimum wage, have bipartisan support if you poll US citizens. It's the corrupt politicians who are united in opposition.
Obviously, neoliberals want to end social spending that wastes money on bureaucracy that isn't a cost-effective welfare strategy, but along with that, along with deregulation, a safety net is essential. It encourages entrepreneurial risk on the part of small businesses, which ultimately benefits the economy. Don't you do it, don't you shut off. And it encourages people to spend money rather than to save it for emergencies, also benefiting the economy. Once we have a strong economy generating a surplus tax revenue, then we can talk about spending that money in more altruistic ways that don't necessarily have economic returns. I might break with neoliberals or some neoliberals on that point. I don't really know for sure. It doesn't really matter because we're nowhere near that. As of now, our policy beliefs are pretty much in line.
Deficit spending is how you build a strong social safety net. Where does she think we get the money for a safety net in the first place? Also, a surplus tax revenue is subjective. She says we are nowhere near that, but progressives, socialists, social democrats, are not advocating that we pull money out of thin air. We are arguing that our tax dollars should go towards valuable public services rather than endless wars and corporate subsidies. Strike 6 for misrepresentation. We can pay for these things by reallocating the budget and taxing the rich. Have you seen our bloated military budget? Neoliberalism differs from libertarianism because it represents the status quo, not some abstract political theory.
Interesting that she can recognize the absurdity of advancing abstract political theories when it comes to libertarianism. Yes, neoliberalism is the status quo, at least for Democrats, which is important philosophically because it doesn't carry the burden of proof of those advancing other political ideas.
Strike 7 for misrepresenting my argument. I was not making a value assessment here. I was just highlighting one of the differences between neoliberalism and libertarianism. Besides, I do not reject libertarianism on the basis of it being an abstract political theory. One can recognize the absurdity of advancing a particular abstract political theory for various reasons, and be in favor of another. Abstract theories aren't equally absurd. As for the burden of proof, it can be tricky deciphering who holds it. I don't think it's so clear-cut in this case. But if we grant that it lies with anti-capitalists who are challenging the status quo, there is a ton of evidence for the failures of capitalism. For example, we are facing ecological collapse as a result of capitalism. I presented evidence for this in my video, as well as evidence for the success of socialist policies and worker-owned co-ops, all of which she failed to address. Neoliberalism recognizes that some state intervention is necessary to prevent the system from destroying itself, but they strive for as little intervention as possible so as to maximize profits.
Neoliberals want growth, not profit, so strike number 2. To be fair, most people don't know the difference between the two. Profit is not growth if it is hoarded or squandered. Neoliberals want to encourage reinvestment of gains into new and existing companies in order to promote economic health and wealth for every class. One way is to incentivize investment, like waiving capital gains taxes when they're spent on purchasing too much spit from the free snacks. When they're spent on purchasing material business assets to expand production. Taxing hoarded liquid assets to force reinvestment is awesome, but companies keep getting around it by skirting reporting laws. This is a big problem. Hoarded liquid assets are a huge leech on the economy. It's just really hard to track them so that they can be taxed. But yeah, the idea that neoliberals are just like okay with this is pretty absurd. I think it shows that she really does not understand neoliberalism at all.
Strike 8 for fallacious reasoning. This is a meaningless distinction because growth is the problem. We cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. Capitalism requires a growth rate of 2 to 3% per year, otherwise we plunge into a recession. A system that relies on exponential growth to survive is not conducive to human or animal well-being. And the idea of green growth is a fantasy. Green energy may reduce direct emissions, but if it's used to power extraction and production at an ever-increasing rate, it will do nothing to reverse resource depletion, such as deforestation, which drives warming. In order to prevent ecological collapse, we need to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. 2 degrees is pushing it. Globally, we need to reach net zero by 2050, which means rich countries need to reach net zero by 2030. The science is clear. To achieve this, we need degrowth, an intentional downscaling of the economy. To paraphrase Jason Hickel, currently, the system has ironclad ideological support. Politicians may bicker about how to distribute the yields of growth, but when it comes to the pursuit of growth, they are united. The very newspapers that carry harrowing stories about ecological collapse also report excitedly on how GDP is growing every quarter. And the very politicians who wring their hands about climate breakdown also call dutifully for more industrial growth every year. The cognitive dissonance is striking. In an era of ecological emergency, we cannot afford to build policy around fantasies.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you!
The good news is, degrowth does not have to come with human misery. In fact, there is evidence of sharp diminishing returns to growth. Materialism actually reduces well-being. We feel suffocated by stuff, paralyzed by too many choices. Wealthy countries have surpassed the point at which GDP correlates with well-being. Growth is now completely uncoupled from any concept of need. The growth imperative creates marketing campaigns that push us to buy stuff we don't need, stuff that doesn't last, and stuff that goes out of style. Our environment simply cannot handle further increases in total wealth. Developing countries still need to grow to the point where they can meet the needs of their people. But this can be done through wealth redistribution rather than wealth creation. Also, how exactly is the free market ideal for industries like housing? Shelter is a basic need like food and water. Housing? Really?
I didn't say free market there, I said deregulation, specifically talking about zoning laws, like restrictions on multifamily housing that make it impossible for companies to invest and to ultimately increase the supply of housing in these areas. This is not the will of the market. These laws also create food deserts, and they make people reliant on cars, which increases poverty for those who can't afford a car by forcing essential services like grocery stores and jobs away from residential areas, and producing non-walkable cities that hurt everybody, rich and poor. And by the way, we're also learning that providing homeless people with housing helps them to get out of poverty faster, saves other related expenditures, and also helps to get them back into the workforce faster, which means more tax revenue and, yeah, better for the economy.
Okay, she didn't make it clear that she was specifically referring to zoning laws. So I feel like that's on her for failing to communicate effectively, rather than on me for misinterpreting. But I read a few of the articles she linked, and these problems she listed, like non-walkable cities, food deserts, and the lack of affordable housing, stem from capitalism, not socialism. People have this view that socialism equals government regulation, and then they point to examples of regulations that produced negative outcomes, like checkmate socialists. But this is overly simplistic. Regulation is a neutral term. Some regulations serve capitalist ends, some serve socialist ends. Deregulation in this context serves socialist ends if it provides people with healthy food, affordable housing, and walkable cities. It's great that she's in favor of providing housing for the homeless. I'll give her credit for that. But only because it results in economic gains?
Conservatives often accuse neoliberals of being socialists because they accuse everyone of being socialist, advocating for higher taxation, welfare.
Conservatives are full of shit. Standard liberals like Joe Biden are far from socialist. But leftists are correct in their assessment that neoliberalism, as it is contemporarily defined, is an economically conservative ideology.
I mean, relative to the far left, everything is, so yeah, I don't know, it's kind of a meaningless statement.
The point is, in the US, the Overton window has shifted so far to the right that our perception of left is warped. In Scandinavia, for example, Bernie Sanders is considered a moderate. I wouldn't describe Unnatural Vegan as a conservative. Based on her policy beliefs, she sounds like a social democrat.
And Hillary Clinton is a social democrat too, right?
This is what I meant when I said she wasn't operating off consistent definitions. She is conflating neoliberalism with social democracy. Hillary Clinton is a neoliberal corporate democrat. She is most certainly not a social democrat. Strike 9 for making no attempt to fact-check empirical claims. Bernie Sanders is a social democrat. Although he identifies as a democratic socialist ideologically, policy-wise, he wants to copy the Nordic model of social democracy. Hillary Clinton relentlessly smeared Bernie as an extremist.
But ultimately, the wealth in society that funds that welfare is generated by capitalist mechanisms.
Currently, it is, yes. And why can't we change that?
It's like she was anti-sun and said that we should get light from burning wood. And then I said, yeah, but the energy in the wood, it ultimately comes from the sun.
And why can't we change that?
So yeah, the sun is evil, right? Causes global warming from all the unused energy, kills people by giving them cancer. Hypothetically, we could block out the sun with a giant space umbrella and then build fusion reactors to generate all of the light and the energy that we need, collecting extra hydrogen from space if we run short on water. So let's do it. Why not? Do you see the problem?
Why does she keep comparing capitalism to things that are essential to sustain life, like food and the sun? Capitalism is not essential. It emerged only a few centuries ago, and it is unsustainable as it relies on infinite growth on a finite planet. Strike 10 for fallacious reasoning.
Again, she clearly recognized the absurdity of libertarianism.
Neoliberalism differs from libertarianism because it represents the status quo, not some abstract political theory.
The status quo is morally important because of the precautionary principle. You don't make changes without evidence that the changes you make are going to cause more good than harm. I'm not saying it's impossible to get rid of capitalism somehow, someday, but if we were to pursue that path, it would have to come from careful study, like the pilot programs on basic income, modeling gradual reforms, then rolling that out in larger studies, adopting them regionally. It's a lot. It's a lot of work. What I am saying is that there isn't any good evidence to suggest that it's plausible today, and that the communist revolutions of the past tended to go pretty badly.
I provided evidence in my video, but she only made it a third of the way through. I'm aware that change won't happen overnight, and I'm not advocating for violent revolution. But we have to push for the changes we need. Not only is compromising upfront a weak negotiation strategy, half measures won't prevent societal collapse due to climate change. Considering we know that our current economic system, the growth imperative, is driving climate change, the precautionary principle should motivate us to change our economic system. We should act on the assumption that the most alarming climate predictions we have are the most accurate. We should prepare for the worst as we hope for the best.
The results have ultimately been countries that, one, never actually make it to communism, as even those countries that identify as having communist policies recognize, and two, tend to move backwards and revert to capitalism, like China. You can even argue that the failures of communist countries like Cuba are because of embargoes by capitalist countries like the US, but that doesn't change the point. If somebody were testing a medication and everybody in the trial stopped taking the medication because the facility burned down, the medication is still untested, right? Like, it doesn't get a pass by the FDA due to like hardship or something. It still needs to be tested. Just as a brief aside on the topic of Cuba, because I'm sure it's going to be brought up and I don't want people to think that I support what happened. It's complicated, but how the US treated Cuba was pretty shitty. And one of the reasons neoliberals favor free trade, even with problematic countries, is to kind of open them up and bring them into the fold, so to speak, of democracy. That sounds kind of creepy, but you know what I mean. It's better and more effective to do this with kind of friendship and love than shame and condemnation and embargoes.
Okay, let's run with this analogy. What if this facility was intentionally burned down by another pharmaceutical company because they didn't want a cheap new drug to compete with on the market? Would you then say, well, there's no evidence that this drug works, so we shouldn't carry out any more trials? Strike 11 for fallacious reasoning. Also, the reason we place sanctions and embargoes on countries is because they refuse to accept our unfair trade deals. Free trade is good for rich countries with well-established businesses because it allows them to expand their markets. It's not good for poor countries because small farmers and local businesses cannot compete with giant multinational corporations. If we really wanted to help bring these countries into the fold, we would allow them access to our markets, while also allowing them to limit access to their markets. Strike 12 for failing to fact-check the effects of free trade.
Same is the case in, what people call European socialism, which isn't really socialism by definition. Still relies on profit motive, still has private ownership, even if a few select industries are publicly owned.
Correct. But you can't claim that Nordic countries are capitalist success stories when they're mixed market economies.
I didn't say they were. I was just saying that they can't be used as evidence for dispensing with capitalism.
The successes of socialist policies within the Nordic countries can certainly be used as evidence in favor of socialism. And the failures of capitalist policies can be used as evidence against capitalism. The US also has a mixed market economy, but one that is much more capitalistic. When we compare mixed market economies, we see that the ones that are more successful are also the most socialistic. What does that tell us?
Pretend a country installs giant sun covers over their parks, over their open pedestrian areas in order to, reduce UV exposure. They put white gravel everywhere. They paint the roofs white in order to eliminate the heat bubble. It works great. But would this be evidence that we should block out the sun entirely with a giant space umbrella and build fusion power plants we haven't tested at grid scale? No. It would be evidence that we should put sun covers over parks, put out white gravel, and paint roofs white. Basically, just because one form of deregulation on capitalism is good doesn't mean that the complete elimination of capitalism would be better.
Again, this analogy fails because the sun is an essential part of our climate system. Capitalism is not. This is a prime example of what Mark Fisher referred to as capitalist realism. The widespread sense that capitalism is the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is impossible to even imagine a coherent alternative to it. Before we move on, let's define capitalism and socialism in the most succinct and commonly understood terms. Workplace democracy, aka workers owning the means of production, defines socialism, whereas private ownership and the profit motive define capitalism.
Since socialism is commonly defined as like a transitional state to communism, communism being the goal, I'm going to focus on communism here.
To be honest, I'm not as well versed in political theory as I would like to be, but from my understanding, this is not necessarily the case. Market socialism, aka workplace democracy, is the end goal in my opinion.
Market socialism doesn't seem to have a consistent definition, but the market socialism she's talking about is not inherently anti-capitalism. It retains both an element of profit motive and private ownership and control. It just shifts that from stockholders and a board of directors to the workers of the company. It also fails to resolve class differences because it does nothing to stop one company from becoming wealthier than another company and then exploiting those companies through trade deals that they're forced into because they have no other choice. It carries all of the same problems, like employees voting to siphon wealth out of the company instead of reinvesting it, but then it decentralizes the issue, so it's even harder to regulate. It also does away almost completely with investment, which just ensures that the status quo classist elite remains so. They can just cycle wealth among each other forever. These problems could, in theory, be fixed by even more regulation and draconian government control over the economy, but yeah, not a great track record there.
She's not working off consistent definitions. In her view, capitalism equals markets. Therefore, market socialism isn't anti-capitalist. This is deeply misguided. Strike 13 for misrepresentation. Socialism, by definition, means social ownership of the means of production rather than private ownership. Therefore, market socialism does not retain private ownership and control. Personal property is distinct from private property. Socialism retains personal property, but it does away with private ownership of the means of production. But yes, perhaps I should have been more clear. It's not profit itself that is problematic, it's the growth imperative. A worker co-op may be profitable in the sense that there is financial gain to be made, but profits are distributed fairly to the workers who produced that value and to the public in the form of social dividends. She is mistaken when she says that workers would vote to siphon money out of the company instead of reinvest it. First of all, they wouldn't be siphoning money from the company. They created that value. It's their money. And second, most people see the value in public services such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure. So it makes sense that they would vote for a part of that value they created to go towards those things. Unlike market socialism, capitalism requires an ever-increasing rate of profit, which means profits must be reinvested to grow more capital. This leads to market distortions. As wealth accumulates into the hands of a small group of people, they lobby the government for subsidies and bailouts, influence lawmakers, buy out competitors, and put out marketing campaigns to get people to buy stuff they don't need. Stuff is produced not to meet a genuine demand, but to maximize profit. In a socialist system, stuff is produced for its use value.
Philosophy is essential when it comes to ethics, but you can't just think really hard to figure out empirical facts, right? Like when it comes to economics and economic policies and which actually work in practice, which result in a functioning system that promotes a GDP that's conducive to human well-being.
The irony! Bitch, you presented no empirical facts. Your research is sloppy. Who says you can't generate a healthy GDP under socialism? Markets are not exclusive to capitalism. You can still have markets under socialism.
I literally just said that I was talking about communism specifically. I'm going to focus on communism here. So an actual anti-capitalist system. Again, market socialism is not anti-capitalist, so it's not at all relevant to what I was talking about. Just pay attention, it's not that hard. Watch the video more than once. Watch it when you're not riled up. Don't get riled up. Why are you riled up?
My brother once said, if you're not mad, you don't get it. And nothing has ever resonated more strongly. And again, words are meaningless if market socialism isn't anti-capitalist. My point was, she is presenting a false dichotomy by presenting communism as the only alternative to capitalism. Her video was titled "Anti-Capitalism is Anti-Vegan," not "Communism is Anti-Vegan." Strike 14 for fallacious reasoning.
You can think up an ethical system in which it is wrong for one person to ever profit off the work of another person. You can call that exploitation, but in order to put that into practice, you have to just not care about the consequences at all. You would have to ignore all of the times communism has been tried and all of the times it has failed, which is every time. Every single time it's been tried, it has failed. It has caused immeasurable suffering and death.
This is just bourgeois propaganda. Ignoring the fact that most socialists denounce authoritarian regimes, and that communist China and the USSR are more accurately described as state capitalist, the death count under capitalism remains much higher.
First, capitalism is a component of an economic system. Aside from like anarcho-capitalist, it's not a system in and of itself. I explained in my original video how those mixed systems still have capitalism, so yeah, like, not what I'm talking about. Second, what is this? What is this graphic? Malaria is from capitalism? Like, mosquitoes don't exist under communism? Or market socialism? What? Communism will give us infinite resources to solve all of the world's ills, I guess? It reminds me of that video, some interview with like Gary Yourofsky, where he's talking about speciesism, and if we end speciesism, then every other ism, every other form of bigotry will be eradicated. It's sweet, you know? Like, it's nice. It's just very naive. Point is, if she and whoever made this beautiful piece of work, if they were being even remotely honest, then they would have to count deaths per capita per year. They're making no attempt to do that. Strike number 3.
Capitalism is a system within a system, but it's still a system. I don't really know how to respond to this because I don't understand what her point is. As for the graphic, if you read the fine print, it says, "These people die not because we lack the ability to solve these problems, but because it is not profitable to do so." Capitalism allows 1% of the population to live in extreme luxury, while millions of people die from easily preventable causes. If a doctor allows a patient to die because of gross negligence, they are held responsible, despite not being the original cause of the disease or injury. It's not that communism will give us the resources to solve all of the world's ills. We already have the resources to solve many of the world's ills. It's about reallocation. Strike 15 for misrepresenting my argument. I'm aware of the limitations of this graphic. Certainly you cannot blame all malaria deaths on capitalism. But it was made in response to the Black Book of Communism, using similar methodology. Notice how UV applies heavy skepticism to claims that go against her narrative, but little skepticism to claims that support her narrative. She claims that communism has caused immeasurable suffering and death. But what was the methodology of these calculations? What definitions were they operating off of? Strike 16 for fallacious reasoning.
So there are 5 countries that claim to be communist. She ruled out China, which is correct. Their system is largely capitalist. So we're left with Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, and Laos. About 140.5 million people living under communism, if we're being generous, so less than 2% of the population. I know that's a big number, but it's not big in terms of the number of people on this planet. So do these people, do they account for less than 2% of the world's preventable deaths? Malaria still exists in communist countries, just to be clear. Averaging malarial deaths from Vietnam and Laos don't stand out as significantly different from other surrounding countries. Thailand also has a pretty low death rate from these diseases, for example. You'd have to compare to certain African countries to find something radically different, and you don't have to be an expert in infectious diseases to know that that's not a fair comparison. Nor is it true, like by a long shot, that nobody dies from curable diseases in communist countries, despite the conspiracy theories about big pharma hiding cheap herbal cures so that they can keep making money off of sick people.
These countries don't exist in a vacuum. They may be striving towards communism, but they're still oppressed by the global capitalist system. It's rational to be critical of conspiracy theories, but it's irrational to flippantly dismiss them all because corruption is rampant. The pharmaceutical industry does in fact act in unscrupulous ways to maximize profits. Strike 17 for making no effort to fact check. And what system can we blame for this behavior? The one driven by profit, where the means of production are privately owned? Or the one where decisions are made democratically as the means of production are collectively owned?
Beyond annual death toll, there are also serious questions as to quality of life. Cuba and North Korea are pretty isolated, secretive. It's hard to get any real data beyond propaganda, but certainly the people who have escaped don't paint a pretty picture. If we look at the most populous, Vietnam, yeah, they don't like it. You know, they're one of the most pro-capitalism populations on Earth, far more pro-capitalism than populations in countries like the US are pro-socialism.
Again, these countries don't exist in a vacuum. North Korea is an example of an authoritarian planned economy, not a system that anti-capitalists like myself want to copy. Regarding Vietnam, I'll take back one strike for providing thought-provoking evidence. The results of this poll were very shocking, I won't lie. It sounds like Stockholm Syndrome to me. But my brother spent a few months in Vietnam, and he said the Vietnamese people were very forgiving, so I am curious as to how the questions in this survey were worded. Because survey results also show that a large majority of US citizens question the core tenets of capitalism, despite not identifying as anti-capitalist. I think this stems from the fact that people are not operating off accurate definitions. They accept the definitions imposed by propagandists. And it doesn't help when people with large platforms like Unnatural Vegan add to the confusion by defining neoliberalism as social democracy, capitalism as markets, anti-capitalism as communism, socialism as a transition state, and communism as draconian government control. It's true that capitalism involves markets, and communist states of the past have been authoritarian, but markets existed before capitalism, and you cannot boil down general anti-capitalist sentiment to communism, and communism to authoritarianism. It's true that some people define socialism as a transition state to communism, but not everyone. There are many different schools of thought on the left, but the common thread that ties them together is that they want social control of the means of production, just as there are many different sects of Christianity. But to be a Christian is to believe, at minimum, that Jesus is the Son of God who died on a cross and rose from the dead, and through belief in him you will achieve salvation. The way she is defining anti-capitalism would be like someone defining Christian belief as the specific beliefs of one particular denomination.
Laos is a failed communist state. They're now following China's lead in developing an authoritarian market economy. Still one of the poorest countries in Southeast Asia, but apparently thanks to economic reforms has one of the fastest growing GDPs. Really sounds like a case of capitalism to the rescue to me. Point is, if a communist or a market socialist ever gives you an example of a success story, do your homework. And if they ever show you this, I don't know, run away.
As Thought Slime discussed in his video, GDP is not an adequate measure of progress in terms of social welfare. It tallies up all monetized economic activity, good or bad. Things like war and environmental destruction increase GDP. A better metric would be GPI, or the Genuine Progress Indicator. If a proponent of capitalism ever gives you an example of capitalism to the rescue, do your homework. And if they use GDP as a measure of progress, run away. This is myopic, short-term thinking. Lastly, she gets a final strike for avoiding the issue, for failing to address the main point, the reason people had a problem with the title of her video. Instead, she focused largely on semantics. Thought Slime, who she didn't bother responding to, hit the nail on the head.
It's wild to me that she goes the whole video and does not address the most obvious argument for veganism, being by necessity anti-capitalist. The whole reason that we have factory farming is because it's really profitable. If you want evidence that capitalism leads to the suffering of animals, just take a look at how we treat animals right now. Because capitalism is doing that already. Absent the profit motive, why would anyone keep chickens in these dark little cages for their whole lives? Do you think people like doing that? Maybe some sadists out there do, but the reason it's the dominant way to raise chickens isn't just because the world is full of sadists. It's because it makes shitloads of money. In an economy that people have more input in, don't you think people might say, hey, I don't like the way that we torture the chickens. Stop torturing the chickens so much. If the economy were centered around human need rather than bourgeois profit, will we use 10 times the soy calories to produce 1 beef calorie? Seems to me that might strike some people as a little inefficient without the lobbying industry tipping their fingers on the scale. I'm not saying that socialism would make everyone go vegan. It would not. But for the people producing food, I think they'd be incentivized by basic empathy to treat animals better if they didn't have to cut costs as much as possible to deliver value to their shareholders. She spends this whole video saying we have to look at evidence. We can't reason ourselves into a perfect economy. We've got to look at the data. Well, the data's in. Looks like animals are having a pretty bad time, actually. Looks like maybe the earth might fucking die.
I think I'm going to make a separate video on the history and inherent flaws of capitalism, but in short, capitalism was built off slavery and stolen land, and it continues to function off wage slavery and neo-colonialism. To function, it must create and maintain artificial scarcity. In other words, we have the resources to meet the needs of everyone on the planet, but access to them is restricted and enforced by state violence. A system that allows Kylie Jenner to have a massive closet full of designer shoes while millions of people starve to death is deeply immoral. Anyone who suggests this is the best system we have is not engaging with the evidence, and they lack imagination. We all need to go back to kindergarten and learn how to share. Thank you so much for watching. I can't believe I just got through that whole script in one go. Definitely thought I was gonna have to break it up because it's probably the longest script I've ever written. So if you want to leave a tip or join on Patreon, those are linked below. And as always, give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment, and stay tuned for next week.
Yo, how when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me no eat no fish, no meat now. How when me eat them, I wonder when me yam. When me tell them say that I'm a vegan man. How when me eat them, I wonder when me eat.